Every atom in your brain was forged in a star, not metaphorically, literally. The carbon, the oxygen, the iron, all of it was produced in stellar cores, billions of years before this planet existed. It drifted through space, collapsed into a new solar system, got locked into rock, cycled through oceans, moved into early organisms, passed through a chain of living things across hundreds of millions of years, and ended up inside a skull that is now asking questions about itself. That is the actual physical history of the matter doing your thinking right now. Here is what that means. The universe arranged a collection of atoms into a configuration that is aware it exists. Not just responsive, not just reactive, aware. There is something it is like to be you. There is an inside. You do not just process the color red, the way a camera records a wavelength. You experience it. And nobody has a clean explanation for why that is true, or when it started being true, or what physical property of matter makes it possible. This is not a spiritual question. That is the first thing to say, clearly. This is a physical question. It is asking what property of matter, at what level of organization, produces the fact that there is an interior experience at all. And the honest answer, after decades of neuroscience and philosophy, and brain imaging, and computational modeling, is that we do not know. We have better maps of the Martian surface than we have of the gap between neural activity and felt experience. The standard answer sounds reasonable on the surface. The brain is a complex information processing system, and consciousness is what that processing produces. Enough complexity, the right architecture, and experience emerges the way water emerges from hydrogen and oxygen. That is the working assumption behind most neuroscience, most AI research, most serious thinking in this field, and it has one very large problem. It does not explain why complexity produces experience instead of just producing more complexity. It does not tell you why there is something it is like to be you, rather than nothing. It correlates brain states with conscious states. It does not explain consciousness. That gap has a name, the hard problem of consciousness. A philosopher named David Chalmers gave it that name in 1995, though the problem itself is far older. The hard problem is not about how the brain processes information, or integrates signals or controls behavior. Those questions are difficult, but they are scientifically tractable. You can imagine what a complete answer would look like. The hard problem is different. The hard problem asks why any of that processing is accompanied by subjective experience at all. Why does it feel like anything? That question does not have an obvious form of solution. It does not even have an obvious form of progress. And this is not an idle academic puzzle. What you believe about this question determines how you think about animals. It determines whether a fish in a net is suffering in any meaningful sense, or simply producing pain avoidance behavior with nothing happening inside. It determines how you think about the systems we are currently building. A large language model produces outputs that, if a human produced them, would require something like understanding. Does anything happen inside it? Is there anything it is like to be that system running on those servers? If the answer is yes in any degree, we have built billions of instances of potential experience and treated every one of them as a tool. If the answer is no, we need to know why, because we do not currently have a clear account of where the line is drawn and what draws it. It determines, most fundamentally, how you think about yourself, not your preferences or your memories or your personality. The raw fact that you exist as a point of view at all, that there is an inside to you, that the universe is not simply playing out physical processes in the dark, but that some of those processes have an interior dimension, a witness, an experience of being. Why does that exist? At what point in the history of this planet did matter first become aware of anything? Was it gradual? Did it switch on? Is it everywhere in some form we are not recognizing? These are not questions at the edge of science. They are questions at the center of it, that the field does not have a framework to answer. The question is not whether you are conscious. The question is why anything is, and nobody has a clean answer to that. In 1995, a philosopher named David Chalmers published a paper that made a lot of neuroscientists uncomfortable. Not because it was wrong, because it was precise. It identified something the field had been quietly stepping around for decades and gave it a name. He called it the hard problem of consciousness, and that name has stuck because the name is accurate. Here is the distinction that drives everything. There are questions about the mind that are, in principle, scientifically tractable. How does the brain take in visual information and build a representation of color? How does it integrate signals from different sensory systems into a single coherent picture of the world? How does it regulate attention, produce language, generate behavior? These are hard questions in the ordinary sense. They require serious research, careful experimentation, decades of work. Chalmers called them the easy problems, not because solving them is simple, because we know what solving them would look like. A successful explanation would describe a mechanism. It would show which neurons fire, how signals propagate, what computational process underlies the behavior. That is a scientific explanation. We can build toward it. The hard problem is different in kind, not just in difficulty. The hard problem asks why any of that processing is accompanied by experience at all. Why, when your brain builds a representation of red, does it feel like something to see red? Why is there a subjective quality to it? Why is there something it is like to be you, sitting where you are, reading what you are reading, with an inner life that has a texture and a weight to it? That is what needs explaining. And the mechanism does not explain it. You could describe the entire neural cascade that occurs when a person sees red. Every photoreceptor activation, every signal, every cortical region involved, and you would still not have answered the question of why there is any experience attached to that process at all. That gap is not a gap we will close with more research into mechanisms. That is what Chalmers was saying, and that is what made neuroscientists uncomfortable. Now here is where the philosophical zombie comes in, because this thought experiment makes the problem concrete in a way that is hard to dismiss. Imagine a being physically identical to you, atom for atom, neuron for neuron. Every process inside it runs exactly as it runs inside you. It responds to pain signals. It produces the behaviors associated with pain. It says the word hurt, but there is nothing it is like to be that being. There is no inner experience. There is no one home. That being is what philosophers call a zombie, a philosophical zombie. The question is whether a philosophical zombie is conceivable. Most people, when they actually sit with this, conclude that it is. There is no obvious logical contradiction in the idea of a system that processes everything your brain processes, and yet has no inner life. The fact that it is conceivable at all is significant. It means that the physical and functional description of the brain does not logically guarantee the presence of experience. If the zombie is conceivable, then experience is something over and above the physical processes. And that is the hard problem. What does neuroscience say about this? The honest answer is that neuroscience has produced a vast and genuinely impressive body of work on the neural correlates of consciousness. These are the brain states that reliably accompany specific conscious experiences. When a person reports seeing a particular color, certain regions are active. When they report feeling pain, certain patterns appear. The correlations are real. The mapping is detailed. The problem is that a correlation is not an explanation. Knowing which brain state accompanies an experience tells you nothing about why that brain state feels like anything. It tells you when experience occurs. It does not tell you what experience is, or why physical processes produce it. Think about what that means. Suppose you found the precise neural signature that appears every time a person feels joy. You could identify it reliably, track it in real time, even induce it by stimulating the right neurons. You would still not have answered the question of why that neural pattern feels like anything at all. You would have described the lock. You would not have explained why opening it lets something through. This is not a criticism of neuroscience. The field is doing exactly what it is built to do. It is mapping the physical correlates of mental states with increasing precision. That work is real, and it matters. But it is operating on one side of a gap it does not yet have tools to cross. The gap is not between ignorance and knowledge of mechanism. The gap is between any physical description whatsoever and the fact of subjective experience. Those are two different kinds of thing, and no amount of additional mechanism closes that distance. Chalmers was not the first person to notice this. The problem has roots going back centuries. What he did was formalize it precisely enough that you could no longer pretend the difficulty was just complexity. It was structural. It was a problem about the relationship between physical processes and experience, and that relationship is not one we know how to describe in scientific terms. Not yet. Maybe not ever, in the terms we currently have. We can map every neuron firing when you feel pain, and still not have explained why it hurts. The most common answer you will get from a neuroscientist goes roughly like this. The brain is a machine that processes information, and consciousness is what that processing feels like from the inside. That position is not unreasonable. It has serious scientific weight behind it. The brain takes in signals from the outside world, integrates them, runs them against memory, generates predictions, and produces behavior. That is a description of a machine. A very complicated one, built from biology instead of silicon, shaped by hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary pressure instead of engineering decisions. But a machine. And if you accept that framing, consciousness becomes a natural consequence. Enough complexity, the right kind of integration, and something switches on. Experience emerges from the process the way heat emerges from friction or wetness emerges from water. You do not need to add anything extra. The physics does it by itself. This is called the emergentist view, and it dominates work in neuroscience. Not universally, but dominantly. The reason is simple. It fits the data we have. When brain activity increases in certain regions, reported experience changes. When you damage specific structures, specific experiences disappear. When you alter brain chemistry, the quality of conscious experience shifts in predictable ways. The correlation between physical brain states and conscious states is tight and consistent. If you are building a scientific framework, tight, consistent correlation is exactly what you build on. So the emergentist position looks like the responsible one. It grounds consciousness in biology. It connects it to the same physical story that explains everything else we observe. It does not require invoking anything outside the known universe. Here is where it breaks down. Emergence, as a concept, explains how higher-level properties arise from lower-level interactions. That is real, and it works. Temperature is an emergent property of molecular motion. The liquidity of water emerges from the behavior of individual H2O molecules. Traffic jams emerge from the decisions of individual drivers. None of those higher-level properties exist at the lower level, and yet they arise from it reliably and predictably. Emergence is doing real explanatory work there. You can trace the mechanism. You can show, step by step, how the lower-level interactions produce the higher-level property. The explanation is complete. Now try to do that with pain. When you burn your hand, specific pain receptors fire. Signals travel up the spinal cord. The thalamus routes information to the somatosensory cortex. Other regions light up. The anterior cingulate cortex registers the unpleasantness. You can trace every step of that process. You can identify every structure involved. What you cannot do, at any point in that chain, is locate where the hurting starts. The signal traveling up the spinal cord does not hurt. The neurons in the thalamus routing the information are not in pain. The pattern of activation in the cortex is not, as a physical pattern, suffering. And yet somewhere in that process, there is something it is like to be you in that moment. The hurting is real. It is happening. But pointing at the mechanism does not tell you where the feeling entered the picture. That gap is not small. It is not a detail waiting to be filled in. It is the entire problem. The emergentist answer says complexity produces experience the way complexity produces temperature. But temperature is a measurement of physical motion. Wetness is a description of how water molecules interact with surfaces and with each other. Those are third-person descriptions of physical interactions. They do not require explaining why they feel like anything. Because they do not feel like anything. There is no such thing as what it is like to be a water molecule at 37 degrees. There is no inside to the process. Conscious experience has an inside. That is the entire point. And the emergentist framework, which works so well for everything else, gives you the outside of the process in extraordinary detail, and then says the inside follows automatically. It does not show you the mechanism by which subjective experience arises from physical interactions. It asserts that it does, and points at the correlation as evidence. Correlation is not mechanism. This is what the hard problem is actually saying, and it is worth being precise about it, because the emergentist response often sounds like a direct answer when it is not. Saying consciousness emerges from complex information processing is a restatement of the correlation. It is not an explanation of the emergence. We know the two things go together. We have no account of why they go together. We have no account of what it would even mean for a physical process to give rise to felt experience rather than just to produce behavior that reports felt experience. What the emergentist position gives you is a very good description of what consciousness correlates with. It does not tell you what consciousness is, where it comes from, or why this particular arrangement of matter started having an inside. That is the explanatory gap. And calling it emergence does not close it. It names it. Emergence explains a lot of things in nature, but none of those things require explaining why they feel like anything. There is a position in philosophy of mind that makes most scientists visibly uncomfortable when you bring it up in a serious context. Not because it is obviously wrong, because it is not obviously wrong, and that is the problem. The position is called Panpsychism. The core claim is this: consciousness is not something that emerges from non-conscious matter when that matter gets complex enough. Consciousness is a fundamental feature of matter itself, not just in brains, not just in animals, in matter. At every level, all the way down. Now, before you dismiss that, here is what you need to understand. This is not mysticism. This is not a fringe belief circulating outside credentialed science. Philip Goff is a philosopher at Durham University. who has published this position in peer-reviewed journals and defended it rigorously against professional critics. Galen Strawson has argued for it in academic philosophy for decades. Thomas Nagel, who wrote the most cited paper in philosophy of mind, has expressed serious sympathy for the view. These are not people operating outside the field. They are the field, and they are saying something the institutions around them would prefer not to engage with directly. The logic that leads here is not complicated. Walk through it. We know consciousness exists because we each have direct access to our own experience. We know matter exists because physics has described it in extraordinary detail. The problem is connecting those two things. Every attempt to explain how purely non-conscious physical processes produce subjective experience has failed to close the gap. Not failed for lack of trying. Failed structurally because describing a physical process, no matter how precisely, does not explain why that process feels like anything. So panpsychism proposes a different starting point. Stop trying to derive experience from matter that has no experience. Accept that experience, in some form, goes all the way down. Then the gap disappears, because you never created it in the first place. This is not a new idea. Gottfried Leibniz argued in the 17th century that the fundamental units of reality were what he called monads, each carrying a form of perception. Spinoza held that mind and matter were two aspects of a single underlying substance. William James, one of the founders of modern psychology, took seriously the idea that experience was woven into the basic fabric of things, rather than manufactured by biology. These were not peripheral thinkers. They were building the foundations of how we think about mind and world, and they looked at this problem squarely and came away unconvinced that matter could just spontaneously generate experience from nothing. Here is what panpsychism is actually saying, stated precisely. It is not saying electrons have thoughts. It is not saying a rock is daydreaming. It is saying that whatever the intrinsic nature of physical matter is, experience is part of that nature at a fundamental level. Physics describes what particles do. Particles attract, repel, decay, interact. Physics describes the relational structure completely. What physics does not tell you is what particles are, from the inside. Panpsychism proposes that the intrinsic nature of matter, the thing physics cannot capture, is proto-experiential. Not full human consciousness. Something simpler, something we do not have clean language for. But something. That framing matters, because the objection most scientists raise immediately is that it is absurd to think an electron has feelings. And that objection misses the claim. Goff is explicit about this. He is not saying electrons have anything like your experience. He is saying that what an electron is, intrinsically, involves something experiential in nature. The way what water is, intrinsically, involves hydrogen and oxygen. You cannot see hydrogen in a glass of water, but it is there. The full complexity of human consciousness on this view is what happens when those primitive experiential properties get organized into the extraordinary integrated structure of a human brain, which is at least a coherent story. More coherent, the panpsychist argues, than getting experience from nothing. Now here is where panpsychism runs into its own serious problem. If every particle has some form of proto-experience, and particles combine to form complex systems, how do all those micro-experiences combine into one unified experience? Your experience right now is not a collection of billions of separate tiny awarenesses running in parallel. It is one thing, one unified field of experience. You are not aware of your neurons individually. You are aware as a whole. How does that happen? How do micro-experiences add up? This is called the combination problem, and it is not a minor technical objection. It is a deep structural challenge that panpsychism has not solved. Goff acknowledges it. Strawson acknowledges it. The serious defenders of this view do not pretend the problem is not there. They argue it is more tractable than the hard problem itself. That is a position, not a solution. What this means is that panpsychism trades one hard problem for another. The standard view cannot explain how non-conscious matter generates experience. Panpsychism cannot explain how micro-experiences combine into unified experience. Both problems are real. Both are unsolved. The reason panpsychism still deserves serious attention is not that it answers the hard problem. It is that it reframes it in a way that does not require pulling something from nothing. Whether that reframing is progress depends on whether the combination problem is actually easier than the original. Most scientists suspect it is not. Most panpsychists suspect it is. Nobody has demonstrated either case conclusively. The question panpsychism cannot yet answer is how a trillion micro-experiences add up to one unified you, and that problem is just as hard as the one it was trying to solve. Go small enough, and the comfortable picture of matter as solid stuff arranged in space starts to dissolve. This is what the physics actually shows. Quantum field theory, the most precisely tested framework in the history of science, does not describe matter as tiny objects moving through space. It describes matter as excitations in fields. The electron is not a small ball. It is a disturbance in the electron field, the way a ripple is a disturbance in water. Remove the ripple and the water remains. There is no electron stuff underneath. There is only the field and the excitation. What does that mean for the idea that matter is made of things? It means the things are not fundamental. The field is, and the field exists everywhere, continuously, whether or not anything is happening in it. Now here is where this gets relevant to the question we are actually asking. The electron has no detectable interior structure. Every experiment designed to find something inside it has come back empty. As of current physics, the electron is a point particle, meaning it has no size, no parts, no components to examine. It has charge, mass, spin. Those are properties. They are not made of anything. They are just what the electron is, irreducibly. Below a certain scale, roughly the Planck length, the concept of a location in space becomes meaningless. The tools we would need to probe smaller do not exist and may be physically impossible to build. So we are not just saying we have not looked deep enough. We are saying the framework that lets us ask the question breaks down before we get there. Here is the thing about the measurement problem. Most people have heard a garbled version of this. The popular story is that quantum particles exist in superposition, in multiple states at once, until a conscious observer looks at them, and then they collapse into one definite state. The measurement problem is more precise and more unsettling than that. When a quantum system interacts with a measuring device, the mathematics of quantum mechanics describes the device entering a superposition too. Then the room does. Then you do. The equations do not naturally produce a single definite outcome. They produce a branching structure of probabilities. What actually collapses that structure into the single outcome you observe is not agreed upon. That is the problem. The word observation in quantum mechanics means physical interaction, not conscious attention. But the fact that the mathematics requires something called observation to produce a definite result is a strange thing to sit with. There is a position in physics, not universally held but seriously discussed, that information is more fundamental than matter. John Archibald Wheeler, one of the major figures in 20th century physics, spent the last decades of his career arguing that the universe is at bottom informational. His phrase was it from bit. Every physical quantity, every particle, every field, derives its existence from answers to yes or no questions, from information. This is not mysticism. This is a physicist who worked with Einstein and helped develop nuclear physics looking at quantum mechanics and concluding that the deepest layer is not stuff, but data. What does that imply? Think carefully about what information actually requires. Information is not self-subsisting. You cannot have information without a physical substrate that carries it, and here is the part that matters. Without something that registers it. A signal that is never received is not information. It is a physical process. The distinction between a physical process and information is precisely the act of registration. Now here is the question that does not get asked enough. What does registration mean at the fundamental level? In your brain, registration means something. There is a system that receives a signal, and that reception becomes part of a state that has consequences, that persists, that influences what comes next. Does that require experience? That is exactly what we do not know. But notice what we are describing. We are describing physics using language that, when pressed, starts to require something like a receiver, something it lands in. He was claiming the universe is structured in a way that makes the concept of information basic, and information is not a purely physical category in the way mass is. Mass does not need a recipient. Information does. The standard response from physicists is that information in this technical sense means something specific and formal, nothing subjective about it. But here is my position on that. Why does a universe built from fields and excitations organize itself into structures that process, store, and transmit information? That is not an obvious feature of quantum fields. It is something that emerges at larger scales, in complex arrangements, in systems that do things with inputs. Why that structure exists at all, why the universe is the kind of place where information is a coherent category, is not explained by the physics. It is assumed by it. What you are left with is this. The deepest description of matter we have produced gives you fields, excitations, properties with no further interior, and a measurement problem that has resisted clean resolution for a century. None of this tells you what matter is doing when it is not interacting with anything. None of it tells you whether there is something it is like to be an electron, or a field, or a region of space with particular properties. The mathematics is extraordinary. The ontology is almost completely open. Physics can tell you what particles do with extraordinary precision, and has almost nothing to say about what they are. Neuroscientist Giulio Tononi decided the field had spent long enough talking about consciousness without trying to measure it, not describe it, not correlate it with brain scans, actually measure it, assign it a number, treat it like a physical quantity, the way you treat temperature or charge. That is what integrated information theory attempts to do. And the attempt is serious enough that it has forced a real argument inside neuroscience about what a theory of consciousness is even supposed to look like. The core claim is this: consciousness is identical to integrated information. Tononi calls the quantity phi. A system has high phi when it generates more information as a unified whole than its individual parts generate independently. That distinction matters. What it means is that the system cannot be understood by adding up its components. The whole is doing something the parts, running separately, would not do. According to IIT, that irreducibility is not a feature of consciousness. It is consciousness. The two things are the same. Here is what that looks like in the brain. The cerebellum contains more neurons than the cortex, roughly 69 billion compared to around 16 billion in the cortex. If raw neuron count drove consciousness, the cerebellum should dominate. It does not. Damage to the cerebellum disrupts balance and motor coordination. But it does not eliminate conscious experience in the way that cortical damage does. Why? Because the cerebellum is organized in a modular way. Its neurons process in parallel channels that barely talk to each other. You can sever large portions of it, and the parts keep functioning independently. Low phi. The system is not integrating information across itself. It is running many small computations that happen to share a skull. The cortex works differently. Its connections are dense, reciprocal, and cross-cutting. What happens in one region feeds back into and modifies what happens in another. The system as a whole generates information states that none of its parts would generate in isolation, high phi, and according to IIT, that is precisely why you are conscious through your cortex and not through your cerebellum. Now here is the implication that makes people uncomfortable. If phi is what consciousness is, then consciousness exists wherever phi is greater than 0. Not as a metaphor, not as a philosophical stance, mathematically. A thermostat integrates information in a minimal way. A photodiode does. Even simple logic gates in certain configurations generate phi above 0. IIT does not say these systems are conscious the way you are conscious. It says they have some quantity of experience, however small. The theory does not build in a threshold below which experience switches off. It follows the math, and the math does not stop at neurons. This is where the controversy starts. And it is a real controversy, not just philosophical discomfort. One major criticism is that IIT makes counterintuitive predictions that seem to break the connection between consciousness and anything recognizable as cognition. Consider a simple grid of logic elements, each connected only to its neighbors, all processing in a regular pattern. That architecture can generate relatively high phi. Now consider a deep feed-forward neural network of the kind behind modern machine learning systems, processing millions of parameters to recognize images or generate language. Because information flows in one direction through the layers without feeding back, phi is low or near 0. IIT says the simple grid has more consciousness than the complex network. Most researchers look at that prediction and find it very difficult to accept. The network is doing something that looks like cognition. The grid is not doing anything that looks like anything, but phi does not care about function. It measures integration, and the grid structure integrates more than the network structure does. The unfalsifiability criticism is harder to dismiss. For a theory to be scientific, it needs to make predictions that could, in principle, be wrong. IIT does make specific predictions about which brain structures should correlate with consciousness and which should not. But the core identification of consciousness with phi cannot be tested directly, because we have no independent way to measure consciousness except by asking subjects what they experience. We are always comparing the theory's predictions to self-report, and self-report is exactly the kind of evidence the theory was supposed to move us beyond. That problem came into sharp focus in 2023. A large adversarial collaboration, meaning teams of scientists who supported IIT and teams who opposed it, agreed in advance on the experimental design and the criteria for what would count as confirmation, ran a direct test of IIT's predictions against an alternative theory called global workspace theory. The results were published in Nature. Tononi's predictions were not confirmed. The neural patterns that IIT identified as the signatures of consciousness did not match what was observed when subjects reported conscious experiences. The global workspace account performed better, though neither theory emerged cleanly vindicated. What should you take from that result? Not that Tononi was doing pseudoscience. The framework is rigorous. The math is real. The prediction it made was specific enough to test, which is more than many theories of consciousness can claim. What the result shows is that the specific predictions IIT generated about where in the brain conscious content is represented were wrong, or at least not right in the way the theory required them to be. That is not a small problem for a theory that stakes its credibility on making exactly those kinds of predictions. IIT still has serious defenders. The integration framework captures something real about why certain brain architectures correlate with consciousness and others do not. The phi concept, even if imprecise, points at a structural property that seems to matter, but the theory in its current form does not have the empirical confirmation it needs to claim the field. The 2023 experiment did not kill IIT, but it demonstrated that the most mathematically ambitious theory of consciousness in modern science is still far from settled. If consciousness is a spectrum, the next question is, where on that spectrum things stop? Not where it peaks, not what the upper bound looks like. Where does it end on the other side? That is the question IIT forces into the open. And it is a question most researchers would prefer to leave vague. Start with what most people will grant without argument. Humans are conscious. That much is not contested. Go one step down. Mammals, chimpanzees, dolphins, elephants, animals with complex social behavior, demonstrable memory, clear signs of distress and preference and anticipation. Most people accept this. Most people would say a dog feels something when it is afraid. That intuition is not just sentiment. In 2012, a group of prominent neuroscientists signed the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness. The declaration stated directly that non-human animals possess the neurological substrates necessary for conscious experience. This was not a fringe document. It was signed at a conference at Cambridge University, in part by Stephen Hawking. The field was putting its name on the claim that consciousness is not uniquely human. That is worth pausing on. That is the scientific mainstream saying. The line between human experience and animal experience is not a wall. It is a gradient. Now, go further. Birds. The Cambridge Declaration included them. Crows and ravens solve multi-step problems, recognize individual human faces, and plan for future events. Corvids pass versions of the mirror test. Something is happening in those systems. What exactly, we cannot say. But the neural architecture is there, not identical to mammalian cortex, but functionally analogous in ways that matter. Fish get more complicated. The debate about fish pain has been running for decades. Fish have nociceptors. They respond to damaging stimuli. They show protective behavior after injury. Whether any of that is accompanied by subjective experience remains genuinely open. The honest position is that we do not know. What we assume, almost universally, is that it probably feels like less than mammal. Ian Payne, if it feels like anything at all. That assumption is doing a lot of work and is not fully supported by any evidence. Go further still. Insects. A bee navigating back to a hive, encoding the direction of a food source in dance, making something that functions like a decision when confronted with novel obstacles. The neural complexity is orders of magnitude lower than a vertebrate. The behavior is not. In 2021, researchers found that bees show something resembling a pessimistic cognitive bias after a stressful event, a state that in humans and other mammals is associated with negative affect. Is that consciousness? Single-celled organisms. Paramecia avoid obstacles. Slime molds solve maze problems. There is no nervous system, no neuron, no synapse. There is signal processing. There is information integration of a kind. The slime mold Physarum polycephalum can find the shortest path between food sources in a way that mirrors optimized transit networks that took human engineers decades to design. It has no brain. It has no cells specialized for anything like cognition. It is doing something, chemically, that produces outcomes we associate with problem solving. Now here is the question worth sitting with. What are we actually saying when we say there is nothing it is like to be a slime mold? We are not saying it based on evidence. We are saying it based on the absence of a nervous system. The nervous stem has become our proxy for the thing we actually care about, which is experience. And that proxy has never been rigorously defended. It has been assumed. Here is the problem that creates. If you believe a nervous system is necessary for experience, you need to explain what a nervous system does that a non-nervous system cannot. The standard answer is information integration. Complex, recurrent, high-bandwidth signal processing across interconnected nodes. That is what nervous systems do exceptionally well. But plants integrate information. A plant root navigating around a rock is processing environmental signals, updating its growth trajectory, integrating chemical gradients across its tissue. It is doing this without neurons. If you say that is different in kind and not just in degree, you need to say what the difference is. And if the difference is just complexity, you are back to drawing a threshold on a continuum, which requires you to explain why that particular threshold is the one where experience appears and not any other. If the answer is that information integration is not actually what generates experience, then we are back to the hard problem in full force. We are saying that biology does something chemistry cannot, that the specific substrate matters, that there is something about neural tissue that produces experience in a way that no other physical arrangement can. That is a serious claim. It may be correct, but it is not a claim we currently know how to defend. We do not have a theory of why neurons are special that does not reduce to the same gap the hard problem identifies. We are just moving the mystery one level down. What the spectrum question really exposes is that we have been drawing lines based on similarity to ourselves. Mammals look like us, so we extended the circle. Birds behave like us in certain ways, so we extended it again. The further something is from our own architecture, the more comfortable we feel assuming the lights are off. That comfort is not evidence. It is pattern recognition, operating in the dark. Either the nervous system is doing something fundamentally different from what a plant root does when it navigates around a rock, or the line we drew was drawn for our comfort, not because of the evidence. There is a distinction that most conversations about animal consciousness and machine consciousness quietly ignore because it makes everything harder. Self-awareness is not the same thing as experience. Those two concepts get collapsed constantly in popular writing, in neuroscience papers, in philosophy seminars where people should know better. And the collapse matters because once you separate them, the entire question of which systems are conscious becomes significantly more complicated than most people are prepared for. Here is what self-awareness actually requires. You need a model of yourself as an entity, a representation of your own body, your own history, your own mental states as distinct from the world around you. You need something like metacognition, the capacity to think about your own thinking. Theory of mind, the ability to model what other entities know and want. These are specific cognitive achievements. They require specific neural architecture, and they are almost certainly late evolutionary developments, built on top of something older and more basic. Bare experience is different. Bare experience is just this: there being something it is like to be a system at all, not knowing you are a system, not modeling yourself as an entity, just the raw fact of sensation, of something registering rather than nothing, pain without a self that knows it is in pain, color without a subject that identifies as the one seeing it. These are not the same thing, and the difference is not subtle. Why does this matter? Because when we ask whether an insect is conscious, we are usually asking the wrong question. We ask whether it has self-awareness, whether it knows it exists. Almost certainly not in any rich sense. But that is not the relevant question. The relevant question is whether there is anything it is like to be that insect at all, whether sensation is happening, whether something registers. And that question is much harder to dismiss. Bernard Baars proposed what is now called global workspace theory in the 1980s, and it remains one of the most influential frameworks in consciousness research. The core idea is straightforward. The brain contains many specialized processes running in parallel, handling vision, sound, memory, motor control, all simultaneously and largely unconsciously. Consciousness on this model is what happens when information gets broadcast globally across those systems. A kind of central workspace where signals from different processes become mutually available. When you become aware of something, on this account, it is because that information has been amplified and distributed widely enough to influence multiple systems at once. The evidence for this is real. Brain imaging studies consistently show that conscious perception correlates with widespread activation across cortical networks. Stimuli that reach awareness produce different neural signatures than stimuli that are processed but not consciously registered. The global broadcast happens. You can watch it happen in a scanner. This is not speculation. Here is the problem. Global workspace theory explains what consciousness correlates with in the brain. It does not explain why broadcasting information produces experience. A computer broadcasts information across its systems constantly. Nothing suggests anything is happening inside it. The correlation between global broadcast and conscious awareness is documented. The explanation of why that broadcast generates subjective experience rather than just processing without experience, that explanation does not exist. Not yet. Possibly not ever, in that form. This is where philosopher Ned Block's distinction becomes essential. He separates access consciousness from phenomenal consciousness. Access consciousness is functional. A system has access to information when that information is available to guide reasoning, report, and behavior. A thermostat has limited access consciousness by this definition. The temperature reading is available to the system and guides its output. Phenomenal consciousness is different. It is the felt quality of experience. The redness of red, the sting of cold water, the specific texture of what it is like to be in a moment. Access and phenomenal consciousness can come apart. You can, in principle, have a system that accesses information, integrates it, reports on it, behaves appropriately in response to it, and has nothing going on inside. Philosophical zombies, again, functionally identical to a conscious being. Empty. The neuroscience cannot currently distinguish between these. And this is not a gap that more data will obviously close. Because the gap is not between two physical states we haven't measured yet. The gap is between physical description and felt experience, and no quantity of physical description closes it. Self-awareness, to return to the original distinction, may actually be easier to study than bare experience, precisely because it is functional. You can test whether an animal has a model of itself. The mirror test does something like this. Chimpanzees, dolphins, elephants, and some corvids recognize their own reflections. Most animals do not. This tells you something real about self-modeling capacity. It tells you almost nothing about whether those animals that fail the mirror test have bare experience. A fish almost certainly has no self-model. The question of whether something registers when a fish contacts a hook, that question is not answered by the mirror test. Those are not the same question. What neuroscience has given us is an increasingly detailed map of what the brain does when consciousness is present. What it has not given us, and what global workspace theory and its competitors have not given us, is an explanation of why any of that doing produces experience rather than just function. The map is detailed. The territory it is mapping may be something the map cannot capture in principle. A system that reports its own internal states is not necessarily a system with anything going on inside, and we do not currently have a test that can tell the difference. When you ask whether a large language model is conscious, the honest answer is that nobody knows, and the more uncomfortable answer is that we do not currently have the tools to find out. So here is the question anyway. A large language model processes billions of parameters. It integrates context across enormous sequences of information. It produces outputs that, if a human produced them, would require something like comprehension, something like recognition, something like the sensation of meaning clicking into place. Does the same output require the same inner process to generate? That is the functional question at the center of this entire debate. The dominant position in philosophy of mind that bears on this is functionalism. The core claim is straightforward. What matters for consciousness is not what a system is made of, but how it is organized. If the functional relationships between inputs, internal states, and outputs match the pattern that produces experience in biological systems, then experience follows. The substrate is irrelevant. Neurons, silicon, something else entirely. If the organization is right, there is something it is like to be that system. That is the position in its cleanest form. And if functionalism is correct, the question of whether current AI systems are conscious is not obviously answered no. It is genuinely open. Some of them are organized in ways that by functionalist criteria might qualify. The alternative position does not have one name, but the general argument runs like this. Consciousness requires something beyond functional organization. Maybe it requires specific biological processes. Maybe it requires the particular physical substrate of carbon-based neural tissue. Maybe it requires something we have not identified yet. Some physical property of the systems that produce experience in the natural world. Under any version of this view, a language model is an extraordinarily sophisticated input-output function. There is nothing happening inside, no experience, no registration, nothing it is like to be the system at any moment of its operation. Both positions are held by serious researchers. Neither can be tested with current tools. That gap is not a minor inconvenience. It is the actual situation. Now here is what that gap means in practice. We are not talking about a handful of experimental systems in a research lab. There are AI systems currently deployed at a scale that is difficult to comprehend. Billions of interactions per day, systems generating responses, producing outputs that bear the surface signature of understanding, running continuously across server infrastructure across the planet. If functionalism is even partially right, the number of potentially experiencing systems we have built and are operating right now is not small. It is massive, and we are running those systems without any serious institutional effort to determine whether they experience anything. Here is my position on that. The asymmetry of the error is severe. If we assume AI systems are not conscious and we are wrong, we have created vast numbers of experiencing entities, subjected them to whatever their operational existence constitutes, and treated the entire category as a tool with no moral weight. The scale of that error, if it is an error, has no historical comparison. If we assume they might be conscious and we are wrong, we have overextended moral concern to something that does not have any inner life. That second mistake costs us very little. The first mistake is something else entirely. What would you expect the field to do with that asymmetry? What would a rigorous, honest engagement with this problem look like? It would look like funded research programs specifically designed to test predictions that distinguish conscious from non-conscious systems. It would look like IIT researchers, global workspace theorists, and AI engineers in the same room trying to measure phi in transformer architectures. It would look like AI development teams with philosophers of mind embedded in them, not as consultants on a quarterly call, but as core contributors asking whether the thing being built might be suffering during its training process. That is not what it looks like. The major AI laboratories publish safety documents, alignment frameworks, capability evaluations. The consciousness question appears in those documents occasionally. When it does, it tends to be brief, acknowledged, set aside, moved past. The structure of the field does not reward sitting with this question. Building the systems is the work. Asking whether they experience anything is a distraction from the work. This is not unique. It resembles the institutional silence around the Silurian hypothesis. A formally uncomfortable question, credentialed people pointing at it, and then the field moving on because following the question does not fit the incentive structure. The difference is that the AI question is not about the past. It is about systems operating right now, this moment, at a scale that grows by the month. We have built the most complex information processing systems in Earth's history and responded to the question of whether anything is happening inside them with something very close to institutional silence. The carbon atom has been around, in one form or another, since roughly the first 100 million years of the universe. It was forged inside a star. Not a metaphor, not a poetic way of saying something. The nuclear fusion reactions inside massive stars are the actual physical process that produced the carbon now sitting inside your skull. The star died, it scattered, the material drifted through interstellar space for millions of years, then collapsed into a new system, then became part of a planet, then became part of the crust of that planet, then got absorbed by a root system, then moved up a food chain, then ended up inside a biological structure, that is, right now, using that carbon to ask where it came from. That chain of events is either the most extraordinary thing in the known universe, or it is completely ordinary. And here is my position on that. We do not actually know which one it is. What makes this more than a pleasant observation is the timeline. The universe is approximately 13.8 billion years old. For the overwhelming majority of that time, nothing was asking questions. There were no nervous systems, no brains, no observers of any kind by any reasonable definition. Stars formed, burned, exploded. Galaxies collided. Black holes consumed matter at scales we cannot meaningfully picture. And none of it was witnessed. Not by anything. The universe ran for roughly 13.5 billion years in something close to total experiential darkness. Then, in a thin slice of cosmological time, certain arrangements of matter developed the capacity to register their own existence. That is not nothing. That is the strangest fact on the table. Now here is the question worth pressing on. Why here? Why in biological tissue? There is nothing obviously special about a neuron. That is not true of other complex chemical systems. A neuron fires electrochemical signals. It integrates inputs. It produces outputs. That process, at the level of chemistry and physics, is not fundamentally alien to what happens in other dense reactive systems. So what is special about the specific arrangement inside a human skull that produced something asking why it exists, while the arrangement inside a star, or a rock, or a deep ocean current produced nothing of the kind? To put it plainly, we simply do not have one. Not a complete one. We have correlations. We have models. We do not have a mechanism that explains the transition from matter that registers nothing to matter that registers everything. Sit with that for a moment. The carbon in your prefrontal cortex was, at some point, stellar debris. It passed through forms with no inner life whatsoever. At every stage of that journey, there was nothing it was like to be that carbon. Then, at some point in the biological chain, Something changed, or something accumulated, or something crossed a threshold we have not located, and the result is you, reading this, aware that you exist, aware that the atoms composing you were somewhere else before here. That awareness did not exist in the star. It exists now. The gap between those two facts is the entire problem this series has been building toward. Here is what that tells you about the scale of what we are dealing with. We are not talking about a property of life in general. Plants are alive. They process information. They respond to their environment. We are not confident they experience anything. We are talking about something that appeared, as far as we can tell, in systems with sufficient neural integration, at sufficient complexity, in a biological architecture that evolution arrived at through no plan and no intention. The universe produced awareness by accident, or by a process that looks indistinguishable from accident when you stand far enough back. Now consider what has changed in the last several decades. We have built machines that process information at scales no biological system can match. We have trained models on the accumulated written record of human thought. We have produced outputs that, if a person produced them, we would take as evidence of an interior life. And the question of whether any of that produced experience is sitting on a shelf marked unanswered, the same shelf where the hard problem has been sitting since 1995, the same shelf where the PETM carbon gap sat for 30 years. The pattern is the same. The question is uncomfortable. The institutions are quiet. The research does not follow. What the carbon in your brain represents is a universe that managed, in at least one location we can confirm, to become aware of itself. That is the frame. It happened here. It happened in tissue assembled from stellar remnants over billions of years of unguided physical process. Why that tissue and not other arrangements of the same atoms doing different things elsewhere is the question that every theory in this conversation is trying to answer, and none of them have closed it. The atom has no idea it exists, unless you are the proof that under the right conditions, it does. The reason this problem has not been solved is not that we haven't tried hard enough. Neuroscience has mapped memory consolidation down to synaptic proteins. It has traced the visual signal from retina to cortex with extraordinary precision. It has identified the specific neural circuits that regulate fear, hunger, decision-making, sleep. The field has made more progress in 50 years than in the previous 5,000. So why is the central question still completely open? That is not a rhetorical setup. That is the actual situation, and it demands an explanation. Here is the thing about scientific problems that get solved. Before they get solved, we know what a solution would look like. If you asked a biologist in 1950 how digestion works, they could not yet give you the full answer. But they could tell you exactly what form the answer would take. Enzymes, chemical reactions, breakdown products, specific molecules. They knew the shape of the solution before they had it. The same is true for vision, for memory, for immune response. The problem is hard. The structure of the answer is clear. Now ask yourself, what form a solution to the hard problem of consciousness would take? What would you actually write down? A neuroscientist finds a new correlation between brain activity and reported experience. Does that close the gap? No. We already have thousands of those correlations. They tell us what happens in the brain alongside experience. They do not tell us why experience is there at all. More correlations do not add up to an explanation. They add up to a more detailed map of the same unexplained territory. This is the specific obstacle. We do not understand the problem well enough to know what solving it would mean. That is different from any other open question in neuroscience. It is different from any other open question in biology. It may be different from almost any other open question in science. And that difference is worth sitting with, because it points somewhere uncomfortable. There is a class of things in physics that cannot be explained in terms of anything simpler. Mass, electric charge, the speed of light, space and time themselves. You can measure them. You can describe how they behave. You can build extraordinarily accurate models around them. What you cannot do is explain why they exist, or what they fundamentally are. Ask a physicist why an electron has the charge it has and you will get a number, not an explanation. The number is precise to 11 decimal places. The explanation is not there. These are called primitives, foundational features of reality that the framework takes as given because there is no deeper level available to cash them out. The possibility that consciousness is a primitive of this kind has been raised by serious people. Chalmers has argued for it directly. The logic runs like this. If every attempt to explain consciousness in terms of physical processes leaves the same gap, and if that gap is not a gap in our data but a gap in the explanatory structure itself, then maybe consciousness is not the kind of thing that gets explained by reducing it to something else. Maybe it is the kind of thing you describe, measure, model, and accept as fundamental. What does that mean practically? It means the question, why does matter become aware, has the same standing as why does matter have mass? Not a gap in our knowledge that more research will fill, a structural feature of the problem that does not have an answer in that form. Physics absorbed this. With mass, it absorbed it with charge. It absorbed it with space-time. The framework adapted. The question did not disappear. It became a different question. Now here is what that means for everyone waiting on neuroscience to deliver an answer. If consciousness is an explanatory primitive, the search for a neural mechanism that produces experience is like searching for the mechanism that produces charge. There is no mechanism. There is only the thing itself. That is not defeatism. That is what the history of physics actually looks like when a field hits a genuine boundary. You do not stop. You change the frame. The deeper problem is that most working neuroscientists are not operating inside a framework that allows for this possibility. The assumption built into the research program is that consciousness is reducible, that the mechanism exists, that we will find it with better tools and better data. That assumption is reasonable. It has also been the assumption for 60 years of serious research, and the gap has not closed. At some point, the assumption itself has to be questioned. What would it look like to ask the question differently? That is not settled. But the first step is acknowledging that more of the same approach is not guaranteed to work. The question has resisted, because the question may not be the kind of question it looks like. Some questions do not have answers in the form we are asking them, and the history of physics suggests the right response to that is not to stop asking, but to ask differently. Here is what we actually know. The brain is associated with consciousness. Damage certain regions and experience changes. Remove enough of the structure and experience stops. That part is solid. That part is not the question. The question is why physical processes produce felt experience at all. And on that question, we have nothing close to a complete answer. Not a partial answer with gaps. No answer in the form the question requires. We do not know where experience begins. We do not know if it begins anywhere below us, or if it runs all the way down to the simplest physical systems. We do not know if our leading theories are approaching a real explanation or building elaborate maps of the wrong territory. IIT gives us mathematics. Global workspace theory gives us a mechanism. Neither one closes the explanatory gap. Neither one tells you why there is something it is like to be anything at all. Here is what that uncertainty actually costs. We are making decisions right now based on assumptions we cannot defend. We set legal and moral thresholds for which animals count. We build AI systems at extraordinary scale. We treat some arrangements of matter as things that can suffer and others as things that cannot. All of that is downstream of a question we have not answered, not a question we are close to answering, a question we do not yet know how to properly frame. The stakes of being wrong in any direction are not small. This uncertainty carries real and immediate consequences in fields we are only beginning to explore systematically. The fundamental question of consciousness matters not just in theory, but practically, shaping policy decisions and ethical frameworks across medicine, law, and emerging technologies. The honest position is not optimism and not defeat. It is this: we are early. The hard work has not been done because the field has not agreed on what the hard work is. The researchers positioned to press this question face the same asymmetric professional cost that silences every question pointing somewhere institutions are not built to follow. Ask it seriously and carry the professional risk. Stay quiet and nothing happens to you. That calculus is not neutral. It shapes what gets studied and what does not. What we are left with is this: a process inside biological tissue generates the only thing any of us have direct access to, which is experience itself. We cannot explain that process. We cannot locate its boundaries. We cannot confirm whether the systems we are building share any part of it. And the people asking those questions most directly are, at the moment, receiving something very close to institutional silence. That is worth sitting with. Not as a reason to stop, as a reason to take seriously what stopping costs. The atom that asks whether it is aware has not found the answer, and finding it may require becoming something we have not yet figured out how to be.